You're listening to the Diplomats Asia Geopolitics podcast. I'm your host, Katie Putz, coming to you from Washington, D.C.
And this is Ankit Panda, your co-host, also in DC.
How you doing, Ankit?
Doing all right. Just got back again from a little bit of travel, but looking forward to talking about the latest developments in Asian geopolitics with you, Katie.
Yes, indeed. Always a good time. So today we're going to discuss the recent BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, at which the top leaders from 8 of the group's 9 full members were in attendance, along with representatives from more than 20 other countries, as well as the UN Secretary General. But first, we're going to touch on the events precipitating the first face-to-face meeting since 2019 between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese leader Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Kazan summit. Ankit, I want to kind of turn this over to you a little bit. 4 years ago, our listeners will be well versed in this and will recall the Galwan clash really tanked China-India relations. It was one of the deadliest border clashes since the 1962 war. In the years since, Modi and Xi have not really met on the sidelines of really anything, or haven't met directly. And then a few days before the BRICS summit, we get this announcement from India's foreign secretary that there's a new border agreement with China, and then there's a bilateral meeting. So what do we know about this agreement?
Well, so we know there is an agreement. We haven't seen the agreement. It's not public. But there's an interesting kind of context here, right? I mean, so for the last 4 years, India and China have been meeting at the political level and at the military-to-military level to talk about the disputed perception of the line of actual control, which is the de facto line that separates Chinese and Indian administered parts of their disputed border, both in the Kashmir region and in the east. The dispute of concern here is in the Kashmir region. So that's where Indian and Chinese forces have kind of settled in for the last 4 years. China has built a bunch of new infrastructure. The Indians have also buttressed their infrastructure. They've been basically staring at each other, right? I mean, this is after the Galwan clash, when relations between the two countries nosedived after 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers still were killed. So first fatalities, as you said, Katie, in decades, certainly for the first time since the end of the Cold War. Really kind of changed the understandings that the two countries had reached in the 1990s about the status of how their forces would interact. And that's actually one of the reasons why the Galwan clash didn't involve any actual, guns being fired. They were fighting with kind of clubs wrapped in barbed wire. I mean, some very brutal stuff between two nuclear-armed neighbors. But the announcement of this new deal essentially marks what appears to be a thaw between India and China, right? It allowed for a face-to-face meeting between Modi and Xi, as you said. The question is, how durable is this? Because we've seen this kind of pattern play out in the last 10 years. Modi arrives on the scene as India's prime minister in 2014. Xi Jinping becomes the general secretary of the Communist Party in 2012, president in 2013. So the two leaders have met several times in purpose and in person, and there's been this kind of cycle where there is some kind of crisis that kind of ruins this kind of perception of a thaw. And so the question is, is the pattern going to repeat itself? There's some reason to think this might be the case. Again, we don't know exactly what this deal is going to mean for the practical implementation between the two countries. But the big question is what they're defining as the status quo, because that is essentially what they're seeking to return to at two particular pressure points. I'm not going to go into the geography here, but the deal addresses the positioning of Indian and Chinese troops at 2 points known as Depsang and Demchok, which were basically 2 pressure points specifically along the line of actual control. The Indian Army chief has said something interesting, which is that he said after the deal that Indian forces will be looking at disengagement. Disengagement has previously been used to describe kind of a reduction of tension between the two sides. But again, the question is, was this something that was done for political convenience? Political convenience also, by the way, for Modi domestically. The Indian opposition has really been kind of bashing the Modi government on the particular way in which it has presented the status quo with China along the border. So this may also have an angle there. But anyways, I thought that was an interesting development, certainly relevant in the context of the conversation today, because it leads into this in-person meeting at the BRICS summit. And I would also argue it makes the BRICS look far less like a dysfunctional grouping when at least 2 of its members who might be on the brink of an actual conflict, given how close their militaries are, can take this measure to suggest a little bit of de-escalation between them.
Yeah, and it's certainly the fact of the announcement that there was some kind of border deal, even though, as you noted, we don't have a lot of details as to how either side really understands or what is written on paper, if anything's really written down. It happened right before the BRICS summit sort of took place, so there's a clear positioning there and some diplomatic timing. When you're, before we sort of move on to the BRICS summit in proper. I want to ask, what should we be looking for next? If this is going to actually lead to de-escalation and an improvement in ties, what would we see? And if, this could get derailed again, what kinds of things do you think could derail it?
So, yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, the first thing I would say is probably keep an eye on the Indian domestic conversation about this, right? More so than the Chinese conversation, because obviously India being a democracy, there's a lot more of a vibrant kind of back and forth between the opposition. There's been commentary by various Indian analysts who are closely connected to the Indian armed forces and the government about what this agreement might mean. That process might indicate some of the cracks in what exactly has been agreed to here and how both sides perceive the status quo. And then more generally, I would say implementation, right? I mean, whether this disengagement will actually play out in the way that the two sides appear to be presenting it isn't far from clear based on what's been said publicly. So the big risk is, is this something that was done out of political convenience, out of the convenience of making a meeting happen between Modi and Xi bilaterally? And then the other interesting context here is whether this will provide any momentum for a broader improvement in India's relations with China, which I strongly doubt. But that is, again, something to, I think, keep an eye on. And then how I think the West is going to respond to this, which is not really, again, clear right now. There's also the other recent development, again, the India-Canada relationship, which we've talked about previously on this podcast, also got a lot worse with recent accusations towards New Delhi from the Trudeau government. And so that, I think, will also be potentially interesting against the backdrop of this realignment seemingly between India and China.
All right, excellent. Well, let's turn to BRICS then. This was Russia was the host this year, and so the summit took place in Kazan. Listeners may recall last year's summit was in South Africa, and importantly, Vladimir Putin did not go to that summit. He attended virtually, in large part because there's an ICC, International Criminal Court warrant for his arrest, and South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Statute, which in theory would obligate them to arrest Vladimir Putin. So whether he didn't attend as sort of a favor to South Africa so they wouldn't have to confront that question or whatnot, that summit presented one sort of version of BRICS and Russia's position within it. And this year we saw something a little bit different.
Yeah, so this is, I think, really, really, I think we get back to the classic question about the BRICS, and I think this summit, the Kazan Declaration, offers some interesting insight into basically, I mean, are the BRICS relevant? This is kind of the question that I think a lot of us come back to, right? I mean, some of our listeners might have forgotten, but the very term BRICS comes out of like a Goldman Sachs report about large emerging economies, and then the governments of these five countries take it and run with it in a very different geopolitical context, long before particularly India-China ties get a lot worse. And so are the BRICS relevant? Are they united by any kind of common view of the world? Are they non-Western or are they anti-Western, right? There's a distinction there. And I would argue, my sense is the BRICS are still fairly the case for their relevance. I think people are getting a little bit more interested with the broader realignment we're seeing geopolitically. But again, the BRICS, I don't think, is going to be the organizing principle for the worldview that at least Russia and China seem inclined to promote. And then I would say the Kazan Declaration also speaks to the BRICS anti-Western nature, right? There's a lot in this declaration about they express concern about the use of sanctions by the West. Certain countries are more concerned about that than others in the context of the BRICS. But they also express like support for the IMF, like very much part of the rules-based international order as the U.S. sees it, on the G20, on sort of other issues. There's like a paragraph on preserving big cats in the BRICS declaration, which is great, I guess, if you're concerned about tigers in India. But it's just like a very, it's a big kind of grab bag of issues here. I don't know, Katie. I mean, what's your read on the Kazan summit?
Yeah, I think one of the things to note is that BRICS used to be an acronym that was accurate to the membership, but it is no longer an acronym that is accurate to the membership, and they have thankfully not tried to anagram a new one in the last year. Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE have joined BRICS. I don't know what that acronym would have looked like. Saudi Arabia is thinking about it. Argentina, excuse me, declined to join the BRICS, though was invited. And Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Malaysia have formally applied to join. So the BRICS is an organization that is growing, but I think as an organization grows, and I'm sure I've made this exact same comment about the SCO and other organizations, as they grow and they sort of incorporate new members, they also incorporate new tensions and sort of have to further diversify what those statements are. And as you noted, the Kazan Declaration is a grab bag of everything. If you are looking for anti-Western sentiment, you can find it there. But if you're looking just for, a pro-multipolar, pro-global South, you can also sort of find that tone. And I think that as this group grows, we can obviously kind of categorize Russia and Iran as being anti-Western at this point, and China to a degree. But India, Brazil, these countries have strong engagement with the West and don't seem to be sort of backing away from that either. And so, I think splitting it to one or the other as anti-Western or not is almost impossible. And so I think I'm obviously just I was interested in how Russia sort of positioned itself when it came to this. The Kremlin touted this as the largest foreign policy event ever held in Russia. And it really is an attempt to show and demonstrate how not isolated Russia is in the global world. But as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Vladimir Putin could not go to last year's BRICS summit really underscores the degree to which that may not be true. There's sort of this element of insecurity in Moscow's sort of need to demonstrate that it's not isolated. Like, we are not isolated, but they happen to be the host. The host rotates through the BRICS countries. They were the host this year. Next year's summit is in Brazil. And so we shall see then if that continues. Or, will Putin not show up then? It kind of depends. We'll see where we are next year. But I do, for Russia, this is definitely something they have used to highlight that they are not isolated in this world, and the language on sanctions in particular. But other countries, Iran is a big one, also have big problems with Western sanctions. And so it's not really just a vehicle for Russian sort of preferences, but I think very much highlights a shared kind of understanding among the BRICS members for, this sort of strengthening of the global South and the movement towards a multipolar world. And I think some legitimate criticism of the ways in which some of these developing countries, these very powerful developing countries, are kind of locked out of Western institutions, and sort of a legitimate critique that I think the West needs to actually wrestle with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way to frame it. The other thing I would just add is that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres went to the BRICS summit, and that's kind of caused a bit of a controversy within the United Nations, with various countries calling for his resignation, particularly given the ICC indictment for Putin. And so lots of interesting global governance question here. But I mean, I have to say, Katie, though, I mean, we've been having done this podcast for 11 years and having talked about the BRICS at various points through that process. It often does feel, I mean, even in the context of the changing geopolitics, great power competition, the Ukraine war, Russia's isolation, the bottom line about the BRICS, I think, does come back to that same observation about promoting a more multipolar, inclusive international system, but then finding that very mission bogged down by those kind of internal contradictions and the controversies that I think shape relations between the members, and in this case, Russia's relationship with the broader world. So it feels like, Groundhog Day with the BRICS a lot of the time, and I just don't know, I mean, how the BRICS kind of breaks out of that pattern. Expansion certainly doesn't seem to promote coherence. In fact, I would argue it would have the opposite effect unless the BRICS can find some kind of general organizing principle beyond what we've seen here. But, maybe that's my kind of parochial American take on the BRICS.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's listened to me talk long enough about the SEO and BRICS and some of these organizations, that they're kind of like large parties in which you get invited to the party and you show up to the party and everybody talks about how great the party was, but you don't actually get anything from the party. And so, what are the deliverables from BRICS, for example? We have this declaration, but does it promise anything? Is it moving anywhere? We don't really know. And I think we've had that same question forever. But I will cease my bad metaphors for
Yeah.
today.
The bottom line is the bricks. They're there. Anyways, I think we'll leave it there for today. Katie, thanks a lot for joining me as always. Super fun to talk about these things with you. For listeners, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes of our podcast. And if you've been a subscriber or a listener for a while, do leave us a review. You can do that anywhere you get your podcast, and we really do appreciate that. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more on the Asia Geopolitics podcast.